Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my commentary today. Imagine the scene in Brussels this Tuesday, December 3rd, 2025, as NATO foreign ministers gather for one of only two official alliance meetings held annually. Yet one chair sits conspicuously empty. The United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio has chosen to send Deputy Christopher Landau, instead marking what Reuters describes as an extremely unusual absence at what diplomats acknowledge is a key moment for Ukraine. This is not merely a scheduling conflict or a technical diplomatic adjustment. It represents the first time since 2003 that America's top diplomat has skipped such a gathering, coming precisely as the Trump administration attempts to impose a controversial 28-point peace plan on Ukraine that European allies feel excludes them from negotiations about Europe's own security future. Meanwhile, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University has spent years warning that NATO expansion eastward constitutes the fundamental provocation that triggered this crisis, arguing that the alliance's refusal to accept Ukrainian neutrality demonstrates an American imperialism that views neutral space between great powers as intolerable. The question we must grapple with today transcends whether Rubio's absence signifies mere diplomatic discourtesy. It concerns whether we are witnessing the beginning stages of American disengagement from the transatlantic security architecture that has structured European affairs for 76 years, and whether the very concept of collective Western security can survive when its presumptive leader treats alliance consultations as optional inconveniences rather than essential forums for coordination. To properly understand the significance of Rubio's planned absence, we must first acknowledge that NATO foreign ministers' meetings function as critical venues for alliance coordination on the most sensitive security matters, serving not merely as ceremonial gatherings but as operational decision-making forums where member states align positions on everything from defense spending to military deployments to crisis responses. These biannual meetings typically attract foreign ministers from all 32 alliance members, creating opportunities for multilateral and bilateral discussions that cannot be replicated through phone calls or video conferences, particularly when dealing with issues requiring nuanced diplomacy and off-the-record consensus building among capitals with divergent interests and threat perceptions. The United States, as NATO's de facto leader and primary military contributor, providing approximately 70% of alliance defense spending, exercises disproportionate influence at these gatherings, meaning that the Secretary of State's presence or absence sends powerful signals about Washington's commitment to collective decision-making versus unilateral action. Historically, American secretaries of state have prioritized attendance at NATO meetings precisely because absence would be interpreted correctly as indicating that other priorities supersede alliance consultation, suggesting either contempt for European concerns or a strategic shift away from multilateralism toward bilateral or regional arrangements that exclude formal alliance structures. The last comparable absence occurred in 2017 during Trump's first term, when Rex Tillerson initially planned to skip the April NATO meeting to attend a G7 summit and travel to Moscow, though the NATO meeting was ultimately rescheduled to accommodate him after European allies privately expressed dismay that America's top diplomat would prioritize bilateral engagement with Russia over alliance consultation. That episode foreshadowed current tensions, revealing Trump's fundamental skepticism about NATO's value and his preference for transactional bilateral relationships over institutionalized multilateralism. Yet even then, the scheduling conflict was resolved rather than simply accepted, suggesting that first-term Trump officials retained some deference to alliance sensitivities that second-term appointees apparently no longer feel obligated to maintain. The current situation differs significantly because Rubio's planned absence comes not amid scheduling conflicts, with other diplomatic priorities, but rather during intensive negotiations over Ukraine's future that directly implicate NATO's core security interests. The meetings occur precisely when alliance consultation would seem most urgent, not least urgent, making the absence particularly difficult to interpret as anything other than deliberate signaling. Moreover, Deputy Secretary Landau's selection to represent Washington adds another layer of concern, given that he previously questioned NATO's necessity in a June 2025 social media post that he subsequently deleted after criticism, suggesting that America's second-ranking diplomat harbors reservations about the alliance whose meetings he will now attend in his superior's stead. European diplomats speaking to Reuters on condition of anonymity characterized Rubio's likely absence as raising questions about Washington's commitment to European security at a moment when such commitment faces unprecedented scrutiny following Trump's repeated suggestions that he might not defend allies who fail to meet defense spending targets, his public admiration for Vladimir Putin, and his administration's apparent willingness to negotiate Ukraine's future with Moscow, while excluding Kiev and Brussels from substantive discussions. The timing compounds European anxieties because the December 3rd meeting coincides with reports that Trump's 28-point peace plan demands Ukrainian territorial concessions, military force limitations, and abandonment of NATO membership aspirations, all without meaningful security guarantees that would deter future Russian aggression, while European leaders learn about these proposals through media leaks rather than formal consultations, suggesting that Washington views Europe as an audience to be informed of American decisions rather than as a partner whose input might influence those decisions. If this connection between Rubio's absence and Trump's broader approach to European security clarifies something you hadn't considered before, the way diplomatic symbolism and substantive policy reinforce each other to signal fundamental shifts in alliance relationships. Hitting the like button helps this analysis reach others who are also trying to understand how transatlantic bonds are fraying beneath the surface of official rhetoric about alliance solidarity. Professor Jeffrey Sachs interprets these developments through a radically different analytical framework that locates primary responsibility not with Trump's rudeness or unreliability, but with 3 decades of American strategic overreach that transformed NATO from a defensive alliance into an instrument of Russian encirclement that provoked the very security threats it purports to address. In speeches to the European Parliament and in numerous academic publications, Sachs argues that the Ukraine crisis stems directly from NATO's eastward expansion following the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, despite what he characterizes as explicit American and German promises to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that the alliance would not move 1 inch eastward when Germany reunified. According to Sachs's interpretation, American policymakers pursued a deliberate strategy of surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region, incorporating Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia into NATO, thereby denying Russia international status and reducing it to little more than a local power, an approach that he explicitly compares to 19th century British imperial strategies for constraining Russian influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. This expansion project began in earnest in 1994 when President Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement, accelerated in 2002 when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty over Russian objections, and reached a critical inflection point in 2008 when the Bucharest NATO summit invited Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join the alliance despite fierce Russian protests and internal European reservations about provoking Moscow. From Sachs's perspective, Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine constitutes not unprovoked aggression, but rather a predictable, indeed repeatedly predicted response to decades of American provocations that leading American diplomats, including George Kennan and William Perry, explicitly warned would inflame nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion and impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Sachs emphasizes that Russia's invasion aimed not to conquer and absorb Ukraine as a province, but rather to force Ukrainian neutrality and prevent NATO membership objectives that he argues could have been achieved diplomatically in December 2021 when Putin proposed security guarantees, or in April 2022 during the Istanbul negotiation process. But American insistence on preserving the option of future Ukrainian NATO membership precluded settlements that would have spared hundreds of thousands of lives and prevented Ukraine's current devastation. In this reading, Rubio's absence from the NATO meeting reflects not contempt for Europe, but rather a rational American recognition that NATO expansion was a catastrophic error, whose continuation serves no legitimate American security interest, suggesting that Trump's willingness to negotiate Ukrainian neutrality with Putin represents belated acknowledgement of geopolitical realities that the foreign policy establishment refused to accept for 30 years. Yet Sachs's framework encounters fierce criticism from multiple quarters, including from Ukrainian officials and scholars who emphasize that Ukraine possesses agency and sovereignty that cannot be reduced to passive victimhood in great power competitions, from European security analysts who argue that NATO expansion responded to genuine Eastern European fears of Russian revanchism rather than constituting unprovoked American imperialism, and from critics like Matt Duss, who contend that Sachs's narrative grants insufficient weight to Russian imperial ambitions while excusing aggression through appeals to spheres of influence that deny smaller nations the right to determine their own security alignments. These critics note that Poland, the Baltic states, and other Eastern European nations actively sought NATO membership precisely because of historical experiences with Russian domination, not because American pressure forced unwilling populations into an alliance they opposed, suggesting that the real provocation came from Russian refusal to accept that neighboring states possess sovereignty that includes the right to join collective defense organizations without seeking Moscow's permission. If you're finding this breakdown valuable and are grateful for this level of depth, the way we're examining not just Rubio's absence, but the competing interpretive frameworks through which different actors understand NATO's role and legitimacy, I genuinely appreciate hearing from you in the comments below. Your feedback helps me understand what research directions serve you best, particularly regarding whether analyses should prioritize diplomatic minutiae, grand strategic theories, or the lived experiences of populations whose security hangs in the balance of these abstract debates. From Washington's perspective articulated through State Department officials defending Rubio's decision, the absence reflects not disengagement, but rather pragmatic prioritization, given that the Secretary of State maintains regular communication with NATO allies through other channels and recently met European officials in Geneva, making attendance at every formal meeting unnecessary when American positions are already well understood. State Department spokespeople emphasized that Secretary Rubio has already attended dozens of meetings with NATO allies, and it would be completely impractical to expect him to attend every meeting, framing his absence as rational time management rather than symbolic slight, while noting that NATO has been completely revitalized under the Trump administration, despite European complaints about American unreliability. This defense implicitly redefines the alliance relationship from institutionalized multilateralism requiring regular formal consultations toward more flexible bilateral and informal arrangements, where American officials communicate when they deem necessary, but feel no obligation to participate in ceremonial gatherings whose outcomes Washington has already predetermined through unilateral decisions. The argument suggests that European anxieties about American commitment stem not from any actual reduction in American support, but rather from European attachment to procedural formalities that Trump views as bureaucratic inefficiencies impeding swift decision-making in fast-moving crises. Meanwhile, European capitals express concerns ranging from diplomatic to existential, with officials speaking to Reuters and other outlets describing a profound sense of exclusion from negotiations about issues that directly affect European security more than American interests, given geographic proximity and historical relationships with both Ukraine and Russia. French, German, and British leaders have attempted to formulate counter-proposals to Trump's 28-point plan, emphasizing that any settlement must preserve Ukrainian sovereignty, avoid rewarding Russian aggression through territorial concessions, and include robust security guarantees, preventing future attacks. Yet their ability to influence American decision-making appears limited when Trump and Putin apparently prefer bilateral negotiations that sideline both European allies and Ukraine itself. European diplomats characterize the current situation as representing their worst fears about Trump's second term, that he would treat alliances as transactional arrangements, subject to immediate termination if partners fail to satisfy American demands for increased defense spending, trade concessions, or policy alignment on issues ranging from China to Iran to climate change. The anxiety extends beyond immediate Ukraine negotiations to encompass fundamental questions about whether NATO's Article 5 mutual defense commitment retains credibility when the American president publicly questions whether he would defend allies and treats alliance consultations as optional, potentially encouraging Russian probing of alliance resolve through limited military actions against Baltic states or other vulnerable members. From Moscow's perspective, though, Russian officials have not publicly commented extensively on Rubio's planned absence. The development likely reinforces Putin's calculation that Western unity is fracturing under pressure, that European allies cannot effectively constrain American unilateralism, and that patience will yield better settlement terms as transatlantic divisions deepen and European resolve weakens. Russian state media has characterized Trump's peace plan as representing a more realistic American approach that acknowledges geopolitical facts about Russian interests and capabilities, contrasting current negotiations favorably with what Moscow portrays as Biden administration fantasies about Ukrainian military victory and Russian strategic defeat. Yet Putin simultaneously maintains military pressure on Ukraine through continued offensives and infrastructure attacks, calculating that demonstrating Russian military resilience while Western support wavers will yield maximum leverage in negotiations, potentially achieving through diplomacy what military operations alone could not secure international recognition of territorial gains and Ukrainian acceptance of permanent neutrality. As these geopolitical shifts continue to unfold over coming weeks and months, I'll be tracking how NATO responds to Rubio's absence, whether Trump's peace plan advances despite European objections, and how Russia calibrates military and diplomatic strategies in response to signs of Western disunity. If you want to stay ahead of these developments with analysis that examines structural forces, rather than merely reporting headlines, subscribe and enable notifications for updates on transatlantic relations, NATO's future, and great power competition. The economic and strategic implications of deteriorating U.S.-NATO relations extend far beyond immediate diplomatic friction to encompass fundamental questions about Europe's ability to maintain security, autonomy, economic competitiveness, and political cohesion without reliable American support that has underwritten European prosperity and stability for 8 decades. European defense industries face existential choices about whether to invest in developing autonomous military capabilities, requiring massive capital expenditures for weapons systems, intelligence infrastructure, and command structures currently provided by America, or to accept continued dependence on an ally whose reliability can no longer be assumed, creating vulnerabilities that adversaries will inevitably exploit. The financial burden of meeting even existing NATO defense spending targets strains European budgets, forcing choices between military expenditures and social welfare programs that define European political economies. Yet Trump's demand for 5% GDP spending would require reallocation of resources on a scale potentially incompatible with maintaining current living standards, risking political backlashes that could bring to power governments even more skeptical of alliance commitments than current leadership. Simultaneously, the credibility of European deterrence against Russian aggression rests fundamentally on American extended nuclear guarantees and conventional military superiority that dwarfs what European forces could independently muster, meaning that even substantial increases in European defense spending cannot rapidly compensate for American disengagement if Trump decides that defending Europe no longer serves American interests. Baltic states, Poland, and Romania face acute vulnerabilities given geographic proximity to Russia and historical experiences that make Russian threats existentially concerning rather than abstract geopolitical games. Yet their security depends entirely on NATO commitments, whose enforcement requires American participation that Trump treats as conditional on European behavior meeting his approval. This creates perverse incentives wherein increased European defense spending might satisfy Trump's demands while simultaneously signaling to Putin that Europe recognizes its vulnerability and is attempting to compensate for anticipated American abandonment, potentially encouraging Russian probing of alliance resolve. Before European military buildups reach effectiveness. From Beijing's perspective, NATO disunity and American alienation of European allies create strategic opportunities for Chinese economic and political penetration of Europe, offering alternatives to American technology investment and market access that make European strategic autonomy appear more feasible than it would be if dependence simply shifted from Washington to Beijing. Chinese officials have avoided direct commentary on NATO internal disputes, preferring to let Western contradictions speak for themselves while quietly offering European nations bilateral arrangements that reduce dependence on American security guarantees by substituting economic interdependence with China that makes antagonizing Beijing costlier than defying Washington. The BRICS nations more broadly interpret NATO's troubles as validation of their multipolar world vision, wherein American hegemony fragments under its own contradictions, creating space for alternative power centers and governance models that do not require deference to Western liberal democratic norms or American-dominated international institutions. Given everything we've examined, Rubio's symbolic absence from NATO meetings, Professor Sachs's interpretation of NATO expansion as the root cause of current crises, European anxieties about American reliability, and the broader implications for global security architecture, I'm curious about your perspective. Do you believe NATO can survive as a meaningful collective defense organization if the United States treats alliance consultations as optional and negotiates European security arrangements bilaterally with Russia? Or are we witnessing the beginning stages of alliance dissolution that will require Europeans to develop autonomous security capabilities they currently lack? Moreover, do you find Sachs's argument compelling that NATO expansion provoked Russian aggression and that Ukrainian neutrality represents the only viable path to sustainable peace? Or do you view this as apologism for Russian imperialism that denies Ukrainian sovereignty and rewards aggression? Share your analysis in the comments. I read them all, and often they provide insights I hadn't considered, particularly from European and Eastern European viewers. whose security directly depends on these questions. When we step back from immediate diplomatic controversies to examine the deeper patterns these events reveal, what emerges is a transatlantic relationship that has lost the shared assumptions, mutual trust, and common purpose that once made disagreements manageable within frameworks of alliance solidarity. NATO was never merely a military alliance, but rather represented a broader commitment to collective Western security based on shared democratic values, economic interdependence, and recognition that American and European fates remained fundamentally intertwined despite occasional policy disputes over burden sharing or out-of-area operations. That compact has frayed to the point where American officials no longer feel obligated to even maintain appearances of consultation before making decisions that profoundly affect European security, while European officials openly question whether American security guarantees retain any credibility when Washington treats allies with open contempt and negotiates their futures with adversaries who threaten their existence. The tragedy is not that disagreements exist. Allies have always disagreed about tactics, timelines, and resource allocation, but rather that the institutional mechanisms for managing disagreements through consultation and compromise appear to be collapsing as both sides conclude that the other has become fundamentally unreliable, creating self-fulfilling prophecies wherein reduced consultation breeds justified mistrust that further reduces willingness to consult. Professor Sachs's broader critique, whatever one thinks of his specific historical claims about NATO expansion, correctly identifies that the transatlantic relationship has rested on American willingness to provide security subsidies whose costs exceed immediate strategic benefits, creating dependencies that become unsustainable when American domestic politics shifts toward prioritizing resources for domestic needs over international commitments. Whether or not one accepts his argument that NATO expansion was unjustified provocation, the fact remains that maintaining NATO credibility requires American military expenditures and deployments, whose continuation depends on political consensus that increasingly does not exist within either major American political party, suggesting that Europe faces fundamental choices about security provision, regardless of whether Trump remains president or is succeeded by Democrats who may share his skepticism about unlimited alliance commitments, even if they express it more diplomatically. The emerging question is not whether transatlantic relations will return to their Cold War or post-Cold War patterns. They almost certainly will not, but rather what alternative arrangements might provide European security and American interests in a multipolar world where both American power and American willingness to exercise that power in Europe are diminished. Europe might develop genuine strategic autonomy through massive defense investments and political integration, though the fiscal and political obstacles appear daunting. America might maintain selective commitments to specific allies while abandoning institutional multilateralism in favor of variable geometry coalitions assembled for specific purposes. Russia might achieve its objective of establishing spheres of influence wherein neighboring states' security arrangements require Moscow's consent. Or the situation might deteriorate into renewed great power competition, wherein Europe becomes a contested space subject to coercion from multiple directions without reliable protection from any. Which scenario materializes will depend less on any single diplomatic meeting than on fundamental choices about how nations conceive their interests, their capabilities, and their willingness to accept risks in pursuit of contested visions of international order. Thank you for watching.